Council.
You're listening to BostonFreeRadio.com.
Hello and welcome to Words on Film, the spoken word show dedicated to moving pictures. I'm your host and movie critic, Dan Burke. And just as a reminder, Words on Film is a show to which you are listening on BostonFreeRadio.com and WBCA LP Boston, watching and listening on Somerville Community Access TV or some community access TV station that was kind enough to pick up this broadcast. And to them I say thank you as always. Or you're watching and listening to me on Facebook Live, either on my own personal page or on Boston Free Radio's Facebook page. Either way you could join me. I'm glad you could join me to discuss my favorite topic, which is movies. And I have 5 new movies to review for you for this show. First, though, let me get into my first segment, which is What's Topping the Box Office. These are the top 10 highest grossing films of this past weekend. And it should come as no surprise to anyone, particularly those who know that next week is Halloween. It's late at a week from today, or rather, almost a week from today. So in any event, the number one movie at the box office this week is indeed Halloween, which is a sequel to the 1978 movie, not a remake, but more on that when I get to my review. But Halloween grossed a very impressive $76.2 million this past weekend in just the United States and Canada. Worldwide, it has so far grossed $90.5 million. That's $90.5 million. And that is against a very modest budget of $10 to $15 million. So already in just one weekend, not even a whole week, Halloween is a certified hit here at home and around the world. So very good for Halloween. My review will come later in the show. A Star is Born is number 2 at the box office, as it was last week and, interestingly enough, the week before that when it premiered. So it's holding steady at number 2, having grossed $19.1 million at the U.S. and Canadian box office combined this past weekend. Against a budget ranging from $36 to $40 million, A Star is Born has so far grossed $126.1 million at home, and around the world it has grossed a combined $201.1 million, making it, regardless of whether it costs $36 or $40 million or somewhere in between, it is a certified hit here in the States and around the world. And we're probably going to be hearing a lot more about A Star is Born come Oscar season, which will be in a couple of months. Venom has lost the number 1 spot and actually fell below A Star is Born for the first time to clinch the number 3 spot at the box office, but it's still doing very well for itself and is certainly living up to its Marvel Comics standards, so to speak. And it looks like it'll do even better. But this weekend in the U.S. and Canada it has grossed $18 million. Against a budget ranging from $100 to $116 million, Venom has so far grossed $171.1 million here in the States and Canada, and around the world it has grossed $461.8 million total, making it a tentative hit here in the States, but around the world it has already reached certified status. Will it reach the billion-dollar mark that Black Panther and Avengers Infinity War has reached? We still have yet to see, but it has a very good chance of doing so, at least worldwide. Goosebumps 2 Haunted Halloween, in its second weekend release, is still hanging in there. Interestingly enough, very much like A Star is Born, it was number 4 at the box office last week, it's number 4 at the box office this week, and it's not likely to go anywhere, especially given that this coming weekend is the last weekend before Halloween, so it may even go up. Who knows? But in any event, it grossed $9.7 million here at home. Against a budget of $35 million, Goosebumps 2 Haunted Halloween has so far grossed a total of $28.8 million here in the States and Canada, and around the world it has grossed $39.9 million, and counting, I should add. But so far here in the States and Canada, it is not a hit yet, but around the world it is a tentative hit. It may reach certified status in both instances, and my guess is it's going to get a huge bump for this coming Halloween. First Man, the movie about Neil Armstrong, directed by Damien Chazelle and starring Ryan Gosling, is number 5 at the box office this weekend, sliding from number 3 last week, having grossed $8.3 million at the U.S. and Canadian box office this past weekend. Against a budget ranging from $59 to $70 million, First Man has so far grossed $29.8 million here in the States and $55.5 million around the world so far. So that means that it's not a hit hit yet here in the States or around the world, but it is in its second weekend release, and it has some very tough competition, especially coming up against Venom, A Star is Born, and Halloween. But my guess is you're going to be hearing a lot more about this movie come Oscar season. The Hate U Give is the only movie in the top 10 to have actually climbed, although this weekend it was released in theaters nationwide. Last week it was number 9 at the box office. This week it climbed all the way to number 6. Will it go any higher next weekend? I doubt it, but of course we'll have to see. But it grossed a pretty impressive high of $7.6 million here in the States and Canada. Against a budget of $23 million, The Hate U Give has so far grossed $10.7 million here in the States and Canada, which means that it's not a hit yet, but it has a very promising start, especially given that it's being released into theaters nationwide and potentially worldwide, although I don't have the international numbers for you for this movie. Smallfoot is number 7 at the box office this weekend, sliding from number 5 last week, having grossed just $6.6 million at the U.S. and Canadian box office. Against a budget of $80 million, Smallfoot has so far grossed $66.3 million here at home, and around the world it has so far grossed $137.5 million, making it not a hit yet here in the States, which is kind of troubling given that it's in its 4th weekend release, but around the world, it is a tentative hit and could potentially be a certified hit in the next 2 weeks, but of course, we will have to see. Night School, starring Kevin Hart and Tiffany Haddish, is number 8 at the box office, sliding from number 6 last week, having grossed $4.9 million here at home this past weekend. Against a budget of $29 million, though, Night School has so far grossed $66.8 million here in the States, which is actually more than Smallfoot, and around the world has so far grossed $84.4 million, making it a certified hit here in the States and around the world, despite not spending too much time in the top 5 in its first 2 weeks. But it's still a certified hit, so very good for that movie. Bad Times at the El Royale is a movie I loved, but unfortunately it's not doing particularly well at the box office. Last weekend it debuted at number 7. This week it fell to number 9, having grossed $3.4 million at the U.S. and Canadian box office this past weekend. Against a budget of $32 million, Bad Times at the El Royale has so far grossed $13.5 million here in the States and $21.4 million worldwide.
I'm voting in the midterm elections because
my constitutional right,
because my ancestors died,
and to make it better for my children.
The women before me fought
so we can remain free.
helping your community out.
Midterm election.
I know every vote makes a difference.
My opinion matters.
I vote.
I vote.
I vote in the midterm election.
Register now on iamavoter.com. And don't forget to vote Tuesday, November 6th.
Brought to you by I Am a Voter and the Ad Council.
Never Stop the Madness, Tuesdays at 9 p.m. BostonFreeRadio.com.
Welcome back to Words on Film, the spoken word show dedicated to moving pictures. I'm your host and movie critic, Dan Burke. Continuing briefly with my segment, What's Topping the Box Office, it kind of bled into my first movie review segment, but that's no problem. I'll just briefly say what the number 10 movie at the box office is, and it is The Old Man and the Gun, which Robert Redford says is going to be his last movie. That's what he claims. He might be right, but in any event, it is at a 4-week high, having grossed $2.1 million at the U.S. and Canadian box office. And I don't have the budget information for you, but I can say so far that it has grossed $4.3 million total at the U.S. and Canadian box office, and I do not have the international numbers for this movie, so I can't tell you what kind of hit it is, if it is a hit at all, but the fact that it's made it to the top 10 is actually a pretty good sign for this film. With that said, let me get into my first movie review of this show, and that is for Halloween, which takes place 40 years after the original Halloween. And even though it's called Halloween, it is a sequel to the 1978 movie, and I guess all of the sequels that came after that, but it is not a remake. And that's one of the things that this movie Halloween did wrong. it should have differentiated itself in its title from the original film. If it could have been called Next Halloween. It could have been called Halloween 40 Years Later. Those titles might seem a little tacky, but they could have found something to differentiate it in its title from the original. And the fact that it didn't is going to cause maybe a little bit of confusion, but how it is as a movie is really the important question. So Jamie Lee Curtis has actually returned to this film for the third time. A lot of people don't remember that she was actually in a film in 1998 called Halloween H2O. It was called H2O because it took place 20 years after the original, but this Halloween from 2018 is aiming to wipe the slate clean from all the other sequels and, of course, the remake and its sequel, both of which were directed by Rob Zombie. Does it succeed? Well, I'm about to tell you. So Jamie Lee Curtis reprises her role from the original and from Halloween H2O as Laurie Strode, who comes to her final confrontation with the killer, Michael Myers, the masked figure who has haunted her since she narrowly escaped his killing spree on Halloween night 4 decades prior. The director of this film is not John Carpenter. It's actually David Gordon Green, who is directing a horror film for the first time. And I got to give David Gordon Green a lot of credit. Not only is he an immensely talented filmmaker, but he is also not afraid to venture into other genres of films as a director and perhaps even as a writer and producer. Some of the other films he's directed before this include independent films like George Washington and All the Real Girls, both of which were really good. And he also directed the very funny Pineapple Express and the not quite as funny Your Highness or The Sitter. But in any event, this is his first time venturing into the horror genre. And I think that one of the things amongst many that David Gordon Green does well is that the atmosphere is really spooky in this film. And the guy who's playing Michael Myers, who I don't exactly know who it is. I'm not even sure if it's the original person who played it in the 1978 movie. Somehow I doubt it. But either way, he is very scary with that mask on and with that imposing presence that he has in this film. So Laurie Strode, again played by Jamie Lee Curtis, is living alone in a house that she keeps very secretly guarded. So guarded, in fact, that she's estranged from her daughter Karen, who's played by Judy Greer, and her granddaughter Allison, who's played by Andi Matichak. And I think the movie would not have worked at all if Jamie Lee Curtis wasn't in it. So I think there are two very valuable assets of this movie. The first is the mood, especially when it becomes Halloween night. And the second is that Jamie Lee Curtis has reprised her role as Laurie Strode, and there's a great climax between her and Michael Myers at the end of the film. And of course, Judy Greer and Andi Matichak are part of that final confrontation, but I'm not going to tell you exactly how that goes. So what's the drawback of this movie Halloween besides the title not differentiating itself particularly well from the original? Well, I thought that, first of all, you're reintroduced to Michael Myers when he's in a facility for the criminally insane, and he's being interviewed by two ambitious journalists who are creating a podcast about the Michael Myers murders from 40 years ago. And while that might be a good setup, there's one problem with that, in that they're creating a podcast, not a video. And the reason there's a problem with that is because Michael Myers, the psychologists have told them, these two reporters, has not spoken for 40 years. So how did these two journalists manage to think that making a podcast and not a video story for whatever news channel they might work for would be a good idea for a guy who hasn't spoken for 40 years? There was that piece of logic that didn't really set the movie off on the right note. The other thing is that Michael Myers doesn't really do anything particularly original. Yes, he's an imposing figure, and yes, that Captain Kirk mask that he wears, it actually is a Captain Kirk mask that they just painted white, that still is scary. But he just goes around and kills people at random, just like he did in every single other film, including the original Halloween. And as I said before, if Jamie Lee Curtis wasn't in this film to have that final showdown with Michael Myers, this movie wouldn't have worked entirely. But unfortunately, even though it wanted to wipe the slate clean from all the sequels and the remakes that have kind of poisoned the thrill of the original Halloween after all these years, it still, I don't think, did enough to differentiate itself from the original. It seemed a little too rooted in nostalgia, other than the parts with Jamie Lee Curtis and the other women in it. So this Halloween from 2018 is not a bad film by any stretch of the imagination. It is kind of fun, but it gets my rating of a checkout. And it's a checkout, which means that it's good, but the evident flaws is that, unfortunately, other than Jamie Lee Curtis's parts, it didn't differentiate itself enough in a really credible way from any of the other incantations that Michael Myers and Halloween had put upon itself. And to be honest, Hellfest, which didn't do as well as this movie, was a better Halloween film and more original.
The Western Scrub Jay. I was taking my science class on a virtual reality bird-watching expedition. All of a sudden, Charlie Kane shouts, "Arr! Arr!" He had spotted the elusive black swift, a bird rarely seen in the wild. For a brief moment, Charlie had not the eyes of a 9-year-old boy. He had the eyes of an eagle.
Teachers just have better work stories. Find out how creative teaching can be at teachdfw.org. Brought to you by Teach and the Ad Council.
Diane Wong here, announcing a new radio program. Let's talk about race. From our beginnings as a white supremacist society to our current existence as a white supremacist society, race is a topic that affects us all, and yet we have difficulty talking about it. Why is race so difficult? Why can't we talk openly about white supremacy? Why don't we like to talk about white privilege? Why is internalized oppression shrouded in mystery? What about lynching? What about gerrymandering and the current Black Lives Matters debate? We'll talk about all of it. Come and join us Thursdays from 7 to 8 p.m. Let's talk about race. Boston Free Radio.
Welcome back to Words on Film, the spoken word show dedicated to moving pictures. I'm your host and movie critic, Dan Burke. The next movie I'm going to be reviewing for you is one I've been really looking forward to reviewing for a very long time, and that movie is The Hate You Give. I've been looking forward to it ever since I found out that the book, which is a New York Times bestseller, that was written by first-time novelist Angie Thomas, was being made into a movie. And I was especially interested in it when I found out that Amanda Stenberg, who I've seen in a number of films, some of which were okay, others were just flat-out terrible, but she wasn't bad in those films, but I knew she had some sort of quality to her. Very much like Chloe Grace Moretz, she's a young actress who's been in a number of films, some of which she's been in a starring role, and even in films she's been in that were bad. I know there's something about her that's, with the right direction and the right part, she's able to break out. And I think that The Hate You Give is a movie that's going to be one of those films. It's not a pleasant or a comfortable film to watch by any stretch of the imagination, whether you're white, black, or any other race, but it is a very important film, and it's probably the best film director George Tillman Jr. has ever directed. George Tillman Jr., by the way, is an African-American director, which is appropriate because I can't imagine a white person directing a movie like this. So to give you an idea of George Tillman Jr.'s repertoire before this, he directed a series of films, including Soul Food from 21 years ago, which starred Vanessa Williams and Vivica Fox, which was a very good poignant comedy drama. He also directed Men of Honor, starring Cuba Gooding Jr. and Robert De Niro, which I think was one of Cuba Gooding Jr.'s most underrated performances, particularly after Jerry Maguire. He also directed Notorious, which is the biopic about the Notorious B.I.G., which I haven't seen, but I've heard some good things about. And he also, unfortunately, directed The Longest Ride, which is a film that actually predominantly had a white cast in it, and it's based on a book by Nicholas Sparks. And movies that are based on novels by Nicholas Sparks usually are kind of the same, but The Hate U Give may be his tour de force. So what is The Hate U Give about? For those of you who are not familiar with the story or have not read the book upon which it's based, it's a story about a young black woman by the name of Star Carter, who's played by Amandla Stenberg, and she has the unfortunate circumstance of witnessing the fatal shooting of her childhood best friend Khalil at the hands of a police officer, a white police officer, I might add. And now, facing pressure from all sides of the community, Star must find her voice and stand up for what's right. The Hate U Give, by the way, the title of this movie is actually an acronym, THUG, if you spell U with the letter U and not spell it YOU. It's actually, it's part of an acronym that Tupac Shakur came up with, which was Thug Life, and it has an explicit word in it, so I'll just try to paraphrase it. The hate you give leaves infants effed everything. That's what it stands for. So the movie and the book appropriately shorten that with The Hate U Give, but it's appropriate for the title of this movie. And you get a sense of Star Carter's upbringing. She's brought up in a household that's not poor, but she grows up in a predominantly African American neighborhood, presumably in Atlanta, Georgia, which is where this movie was filmed. And even though her family's relatively well off, she does live in a crime-ridden neighborhood that's run by a drug kingpin whose name is King, who's played by Anthony Mackie. And her parents, by the way, are played by Regina Hall and Russell Hornsby, who not only do very well playing Amandla Stenberg's parents, but the two of them have amazing chemistry together, much to the embarrassment of their children sometimes. But, you take what you can get. So, in any event, Star not only struggles with growing up in this neighborhood, but she also goes to a private school that is predominantly white, and the experiences she has with some of her white best friends and her white boyfriend are certainly poignant. I can't exactly sympathize with the situation, but I certainly can empathize. And anytime that a white student tried to speak to her using slang terms, it made me cringe every time, which I think is the idea of the film. As a matter of fact, I think The Hate U Give is up there with Get Out and Dear White People, not only as an excellent film about the African American experience, but also a textbook example of what white people should not say to black people out of probably fear of being labeled tacky, and I think probably appropriately so. But any event, moving on, the scene where the police officer shoots her best friend Khalil is undoubtedly the most horrific moment of this movie, and it's certainly a moment that, while it is fictional, as in this book and this movie is not based on a true story, based on real confrontations between African Americans and the police, this situation feels all too real. And that's the reason that a lot of people are going to be uncomfortable watching this film. But fortunately, to this movie's credit, it presents a lot of issues within the African American community and the African American experience that I don't think any other film that has not been directed by Spike Lee has ever addressed so much. And I really appreciate this film and the people who wrote it and the actors in it for that. And you also wouldn't normally see a movie like this get released nationwide, but I especially think in this day and age, it's really important for just about everyone to see this film. It is rated PG-13, and they did squeeze a few more F words into this film than a PG-13 movie usually allows, but I do think that's good because I think people who are probably 13 years old or older of any race should see this film. This is probably so far one of my favorite films of the year, and it gets my rating of a knockout. It's very well directed, it's especially well acted, very well written, and it is unquestionably Amanda Stenberg's best performance, and I'd like to see her in better films after this.
I'm probably okay to have one more drink before I drive home. I'm probably okay. I open the window to stay alert. Probably okay. I just popped some gum in my mouth.
Step out of the car, please.
I probably made a mistake.
Probably okay isn't okay when it comes to drinking and driving. If you see a warning sign, stop and call a cab, a car, or a friend. Buzzed driving is drunk driving. A message brought to you by NHTSA and the Ad Council.
I love those real sick signs. They're the ones that move me. The thinly blow, neurotic tone. Intensify and groove me.
All this and more on Unpopular Music. Saturdays at noon on Boston Free Radio.
Welcome back to Words on Film, the spoken word show dedicated to moving pictures. I'm your host and movie critic, Dan Burke. The next movie I'm going to review is Colette, which is the latest film starring Keira Knightley. And this is a film that's been out for a couple of weeks, but I didn't actually get the chance to review it until this past weekend. And now that I've seen it, I'm really glad that I saw it. It's a movie that's actually based on a true story, and it's about a real-life writer named Gabrielle Colette who lived in Paris in the late 1800s and early 20th century. And she is a writer who created a very popular, I guess you could say, fictional character. I mean, of course you could say it's a fictional character because it is, but it's almost an alter ego. And that character, who was very popular in France, but probably didn't pick up any particular popularity in the English-speaking world, although I could be wrong about that, is a woman who is somewhat promiscuous. And, of course, when these memoirs are written about this woman, she becomes a runaway success in the literary world of France. Unfortunately, Colette's husband, whose name is Henry Gauthier Villars, who's played in this movie by Dominic West, takes full credit for writing these fictional memoirs based on the idea that was pretty prominent in the late 19th and early 20th century, in that female writers don't sell particularly well. Fortunately, society has come a long way from that, but there's still that sexist idea that women can't sell as well as men can. But then again, of course, you have today J.K. Rowling as one example of a woman who sells especially well whenever she writes a book or a play. But in the context of the period of this film, that's the idea. So as the real Colette is writing these memoirs about this precocious woman, her husband is getting all the credit for it, while at the same time, even though the two of them are doing extremely well for themselves because of this faux memoir, it is causing a rift between the two of them, and their marriage becomes less one of love and more one of professionalism that could eventually break apart should these two decide to split up. But when you first are introduced to the two of them and you see them married, you find that Henry, again played by Dominic West, has a bit of a wandering eye and even cheats on his wife, despite the fact that she is Keira Knightley, and also the fact that he is rather tight on money and still has time and money to visit prostitutes. So I think that Keira Knightley and Dominic West do really well in this film, playing Gabrielle Colette and Henry Gauthier Villars, respectively. And it is a really surprisingly fun and sexy film that I did not expect to be as erotic as it was. As it turns out, the two of them have, in the wake of their literary success, various liaisons with certain partners. In fact, there's one woman who comes into their life who is a debutante from Louisiana. She's an American, although a French American. And both Keira Knightley's character and Dominic West's character have extramarital affairs with her without the two of them even knowing. And there are other episodes like this. In fact, the movie is not short on any erotic scenes at all, which might attract the attention of any people, particularly guys, who wouldn't go see a film with Keira Knightley in it thinking that it's a snooty British film. But don't be fooled by that. It does have a lot of erotic scenes in it, but none that, unlike Henry and June, slow the pace of the story. And I certainly appreciated the film for that. It's directed by a man by the name of Wash Westmoreland, who directed one film a couple of years ago called Still Alice, which was the film that earned Julianne Moore an Academy Award. He also directed actually a series of films that, despite the fact that he is British, he has directed a number of films that take place in America, including Quinceañera, which is a 2006 film that he directed, and also another film called The Last of Robin Hood, which is a film that stars Kevin Kline in addition to a number of other people. And this is his first film that he's directed since Still Alice. But man, it's probably one of his best, and he has an amazing track record. And Keira Knightley and Dominic West here play native French people, and it is kind of confusing when you actually see Keira Knightley writing a manuscript, and she is saying the words in her head in English, but she's writing the words down in French. And when a movie does that, it kind of makes me think, would this movie have been better if it was made by French people, presumably for French people, and any other person who watched it and wouldn't mind reading subtitles at the end, would they enjoy it? Maybe, but I still think in spite of that, Keira Knightley and Dominic West did a great job in this film, especially Keira Knightley. Keira Knightley is, of course, dominating in this film. She's sexy and she is extremely appealing, as she is in almost every one of her films. And whether or not you know about the previous writings of Colette, or you know about the situation between her and her husband, who was taking the credit for the manuscripts, watching this movie will probably make you want to read a translation, in my case, of Colette's novels. I know I certainly will probably check her books out of the library when I get the chance, because the books that Colette wrote about this female character are probably just as controversial yet popular as other novels such as Lady Chatterley's Lover or Tropic of Cancer, or even maybe 50 Shades of Grey, but hopefully it's better than 50 Shades of Grey. But it gets my rating of a knockout, this movie does, because Keira Knightley is mesmerizing in it. Dominic West serves as a good counterpoint to her character, and it's just overall a very great film.
So I'm a cat, and I just moved in with this new human, and she's got this little toy she's always playing with, all day long. Tap, 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 bloop, bloop. She can't put it down. There it is. Oh, and get this. She even talks to it. Last week, she asked it for Chinese, and guess what? Egg rolls showed up. Like magic. Humans have cool toys.
A person is the best thing to happen to a shelter pet. Be that person. Adopt. Brought to you by the Ad Council and the ShelterPetProject.org.
It's all about free speech, baby. Radio your way. BostonFreeRadio.com.
Tune into my music radio show, Voices of Time, heard live each and every Wednesday from 3 to 5 p.m. Eastern Time on Boston Free Radio at bostonfreeradio.com. Voices of Time, while founded on the golden age of music from the 60s and 70s in all its permutations, also visits other eras and many genres. We feature rock and roll from its original era and beyond, rock in all its variations including prog, psychedelia, garage and punk, Motown, old school R&B, soul, blues, jazz, gospel, folk, old school country, zydeco, all music New Orleans, rockabilly, bluegrass, world music, comedy, poetry, and spoken word, and much more. Please come and join me for an adventurous 2-hour ride into the stratosphere of sound where the voices of time reverberate for all eternity.
Welcome back to Words on Film, the spoken word show dedicated to moving pictures. I'm your host and movie critic, Dan Burke. The next movie I'm going to be reviewing for you is Beautiful Boy, which is based on actually not one, but two best-selling memoirs from father and son David Sheff, who is a freelance writer, and Nick Sheff, who certainly has a talent for writing, but I'm not exactly sure if the real Nick Sheff is a professional writer. I do know, however, that he wrote a book based on his experiences as a drug addict. The book that David Sheff, his father, wrote was called Beautiful Boy, which is what the movie is named. And the book that his son, Nick Sheff, wrote is called Tweak. So what the screenwriters Luke Davies and Felix von Groeningen have done, and Felix von Groeningen directed the film as well, is combined these two and gave you the full experience of what Nick Sheff had experienced as a crystal meth addict and what his father, David Sheff, experienced as his worrying parent, trying to see his son overcome this addiction, but unfortunately falling victim to his resorting to a number of very dangerous habits, not only using the drugs, but also breaking into the house at one point and robbing the family of whatever money they had laying around. It is a very sad story, but Steve Carell plays David Sheff incredibly well, almost to a heartbreaking point that I don't think Steve Carell has ever played in any of the movies he's been in, including Little Miss Sunshine, where even though that was a comedy, that was more like a comedy drama, and he certainly played a sad character, but I don't think even his performance in Little Miss Sunshine compares to his performance here. This may be his best dramatic performance of his career, and yes, that does include his Academy Award nominated turn in Foxcatcher. In Foxcatcher, he was playing a character, but here he plays somebody who could have probably been Steve Carell himself. And the character of Nick Sheff, the son who struggles with drug addiction, is played by Academy Award nominee Timothée Chalamet, who you might remember last year from two great movies, or at least one great movie and one that a lot of other critics called great, but I didn't think it was especially great. The one I thought was great was Lady Bird, which was directed by Greta Gerwig and starred Saoirse Ronan. And the other one, which I thought and still think is overrated, is Call Me By Your Name. But with that said, even though I wasn't crazy about Call Me By Your Name, I still think that Timothée Chalamet was great in that movie, and he deserved an Oscar nomination. But here, he plays somebody who is a lot more heartbreaking, in that he is a very smart kid. According to this movie, he applied to 6 colleges and got into all of them. But unfortunately, his addiction to crystal meth cost him quite a bit, not only potentially his future, but also his life. And as a matter of fact, I went into this film having not read either of the memoirs, and I was actually not only concerned for the character of Nick Sheff, basically the real person, but also I was doubtful he was still going to be alive by the end of the movie. Whether or not he lives, I'm not going to tell you because Words on Film is a spoiler-free show. But I will tell you, if you haven't read the memoirs and you're not familiar with David Sheff or his son, you will be gripped by the end of this movie. I guarantee you. And Steve Carell and Timothée Chalamet are absolutely believable as father and son, and they're absolutely believable both as heartbroken individuals. And I might be exaggerating a little bit there in terms of heartbreaking, but I don't actually think I am. There are also some other stellar supporting performances here by the likes of Maura Tierney, who plays Nick Sheff's stepmother and David Sheff's second wife. And she doesn't say a ton in this film, but there are also moments of heartbreaking realism involving Maura Tierney's character, particularly one time in this film where Timothée Chalamet's character and his girlfriend break into the house when his family isn't there, but then within seconds of them arriving, they escape, and Maura Tierney's character actually gets in the car and chases them as they're making their escape. And it just shows you the dedication of this woman despite not being a blood relative of this kid. And it also emphasizes how much of a disease addiction actually is and how it's still underfunded by the government as a whole, and how it needs probably a lot more support than just a loving family and stints in rehab. There's a reason they call rehab stays stints, because they usually are not particularly effective and they don't especially work, unfortunately, for a lot of people. And eventually, some people who are drug addicts get so addicted that eventually they're going to die inevitably. If they take drugs, they're going to die, and if they withdraw from them, they're also going to die. And Nick Sheff gets to that point, and it is really tragic. This movie is certainly a tragedy all around. There's also a great supporting performance, again with very few words, but equal poignancy and heartbreaking authenticity, which is Amy Ryan's character of Vicky Sheff, who is Nick Sheff's birth mother and David Sheff's first wife. And the two of them live on opposite ends of the country. David Sheff lives near the San Francisco area, and Amy Ryan's character lives in New York City, but she struggles with her son's addiction almost as much as Steve Carell's character. And of course, there are some demons that come out of their previous marriage that become apparent as this movie progresses. And you see, of course, Timothée Chalamet's character go from successfully being sober for almost 2 years to relapsing again. It's heartbreaking, but again, it's not an easy movie to watch, but it gets my rating of a knockout because it has stellar performances, especially by Steve Carell and Timothée Chalamet.
Is my kid in the right car seat? I guess she is.
There are probably rules on when to move up to a booster seat, aren't there?
Rear facing, forward facing. I think I have it right.
Car crashes are a leading killer of children 1 to 13. Are your children in the right car seat for their age and size? Don't think you know you know. Go to safercar.gov/the right seat. Brought to you by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration and the Ad Council.
Hey, it's Genevieve, a.k.a. Miss Fab 617.
And it's your girl, Crystal, a.k.a. The Crystal Lens.
We're coming to you from our new show called
Boston Come Through. We'll be bringing you the latest and greatest things happening in and around Boston. We'll be talking what? Black-owned businesses, social events, and the Black experience. How's that sound, Genevieve?
I love it.
Dig it.
Tune in every Wednesday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time on Boston Free Radio.
Boston, come through. Come listen.
Welcome back to Words on Film, the spoken word show dedicated to moving pictures. I'm your host and movie critic, Dan Burke. The next movie I'm going to be reviewing for you is The Kindergarten Teacher, which is a movie that is a Netflix original, and it's directed by a woman by the name of Sarah Colangelo, who has only directed one film before this, and it's a movie I haven't seen, but it's one that's come out in 2014 called Little Accidents, which co-stars Elizabeth Banks and has a few unknowns in it. I haven't seen that film, but this movie, which is The Kindergarten Teacher, stars Maggie Gyllenhaal as a kindergarten teacher in New York City who becomes obsessed with one of her students whom she believes is a child prodigy. And eventually well, it already says that she becomes obsessed. Obsessed might be the wrong word for this title, or rather this plot synopsis that I read off for you. I would probably call it a borderline obsession. It certainly doesn't delve into anything sexual. And as I was watching the film, and I was watching it on Netflix, and a lot of times when I'm watching a film on Netflix, I do check to see how much time is left in the film, not necessarily because I'm impatient, but also because there's a certain premise that this movie has, and when you hear that she becomes dangerously obsessed with one of her students, you begin to think, especially in this day and age of an unfortunate number of teachers having sex with their students, that this is a sexual relationship, which is just about sick for any student-teacher relationship that's probably high school and below, but it's especially sick for a kindergarten teacher to have that kind of relationship with a student. The movie could have gone there, but fortunately it didn't. But in any event, Maggie Gyllenhaal in this film plays a teacher named Lisa Spinelli, who finds out that one of her students, who is a kid named Jimmy Roy, who's only 5.5, and he's played by Parker Sebak, is a genius when it comes to writing poetry. Apparently, when he gets a poem in mind, he paces back and forth and just recites the poem out loud. And because he's just learning to write, he can't write these poems down. So Maggie Gyllenhaal's character finds herself actually writing the poems down and submitting them falsely to her night poetry class under the assumption that she wrote the poems. But she doesn't intend to take credit for the poems, but she just wants to present them to this night school class and see what they think. And when the class reacts positively to these poems and even mildly questioning the authenticity of them, that's when Maggie Gyllenhaal's character knows that this young child, Jimmy Roy, has a special gift. But unfortunately, it's a gift that's not particularly nurtured by his jaded nanny, who is a young woman who's played by Rose Salazar, whose name is Becca, or his busy father, who is a DJ and basically works nights and rarely sees his son. So I'm not going to tell you how Lisa Spinelli, Maggie Gyllenhaal's character, resolves this situation, but it is certainly an overstepping of boundaries in which Maggie Gyllenhaal's character takes place. And it's not because she is a sick person or a sexually perverted person. And a lot of times watching this film, I thought the movie was going to go there, but fortunately it didn't. And I think that if it did go there, it probably would have been unnecessarily exploitative and would have veered the film in an entirely different, not to mention disturbing, direction. So I'm glad that the film stuck to its guns and made you sympathize with Maggie Gyllenhaal's character. I know I certainly did. And Maggie Gyllenhaal is an actress who will be 41 in a couple of years. And in this movie, she plays somebody who's been a kindergarten teacher for 20 years and has 2 teenage kids. And I know that Maggie Gyllenhaal has 2 kids, but they're not even close to teenage. But yeah, I was watching this and thinking, isn't Maggie Gyllenhaal a little young to have kids who are teenagers? That might not be so far-fetched as this film came out in the 90s, but here in this decade, when a lot of people are getting married into their early to mid-30s, that seems to be more the average. It's unlikely, but it is possible without raising issues about teen pregnancy. But in any event, as I said, this movie makes you sympathize with Maggie Gyllenhaal's character, but also being on the periphery, you can see how her behavior towards this kid is mildly inappropriate. And also, you can also sense that there is a certain way that society, particularly American society, treats prodigies. And it's not like in the days of Mozart, where Mozart was 6 years old and playing to kings and queens. We don't have that kind of mentality towards intelligent people in society, and not even in a city as cultured and as sophisticated as New York City. And Boston's in that category too, don't get me wrong, but the only thing I hate about New York is the sports teams. I'll just say that much right now, especially given that the Red Sox are in the World Series right now, which I'm very excited about. But getting back to the subject at hand, The Kindergarten Teacher is an original film, and fortunately it's on Netflix now, so if you want to check it out, you can without going out to a theater, which I think is great. And Netflix has been kind of hit or miss in terms of its original films, but when it comes out with a really great film, it certainly should be commended for it. And The Kindergarten Teacher gets my rating of a knockout. I commend it for its originality. I commend it for Maggie Gyllenhaal's great performance and Sarah Colangelo's very focused direction here. And many of the supporting players in this film are good as well, including Gael Garcia Bernal and Otto Blankson Wood, amongst other people. And the kid in this movie is not quite adorable, but he certainly is poignant and put in a very realistic performance as well.
Titans go! When the Teen Titans go to the movies, they know the best way to travel is safely.
Hollywood, here we come!
To keep your child safe, be sure to use the right car seat for their age and size.
Exactly. We're finally on the big screen.
Have a seat, my dude. For more information on finding the right seat, visit nhtsa.gov/the right seat.
Gotcha. That's a wise move.
Brought to you by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration and the Ad Council.
Every Tuesday at 3, something special happens on Boston Free Radio. Why, it's Toppers with your host, Gil. Toppers, spinning the tunes that today's youth demand, from Justin Bieber to Lady Gaga to the Fleetwoods, and, on occasion, Hoagie Carmichael. If you missed the program, you can check out the archives at Toppers Radio, that's one word, .blogspot.com. Toppers.
Welcome back to Words on Film, the spoken word show dedicated to moving pictures. I'm your host and movie critic, Dan Burke. And now that I've reviewed all 5 movies that I told you I was going to review, it's now time for my final segment of the show, which is What's Coming Up Next. This is a spoken word preview of films that are potentially coming out in theaters near you. Again, dates are subject to change for the release of these films, and some of them may be coming out in limited release. But check your local listings for times and theaters and so forth. And one of the big movies that's coming out in limited release this weekend, which means that it may or may not be coming out in the theater near you or me, is a remake of Suspiria, which is about a darkness that's swirling at the center of a world-renowned dance company, one that will engulf the artistic director, an ambitious young dancer, and a grieving psychotherapist. Some will succumb to the nightmare, others will finally wake up. So Suspiria is, of course, a remake of a cult classic film, which came out in the early 80s and was directed by the Italian director Dario Argento, who I've seen the original Suspiria from, I believe it was 1980, if I'm not mistaken. Oh, it's actually 1977. And I did see this at a midnight screening, and it certainly is a film that might be good to watch for Halloween, but it's certainly not inappropriate to watch other times of the year too. It's not one of those fun Halloween movies. It certainly is very disturbing. And it is Hollywood making a pretty big mistake of remaking a good film, but it is remaking a good foreign film, which might get a pass. And instead of Jessica Harper in the lead role in this film, Dakota Johnson is actually in the lead. And Dakota Johnson probably has more to live up to in this film than she has in any other film that's not been named 50 Shades, whatever. So I've been saying before that I like Dakota Johnson, and every film I've seen her in except 50 Shades, fill in the blank, has been really good, and she's been really good in them. So Suspiria might change my opinion slightly. But, of course, I'll have to see the film, and if it is coming out in a theater near me, I will review it for you come next week. It's a film that's longer than average. It's 152 minutes, which is 2 hours and 32 minutes. So it's ambitious, certainly, and it also co-stars Tilda Swinton, so it might be good. But then again, I don't exactly know. But if I see it next week, I'll let you know on next week's show. Another movie that's probably coming out in theaters worldwide is one called Hunted Killer. This is a movie about an untested American submarine captain that teams with U.S. Navy SEALs to rescue the Russian president who has been kidnapped by a rogue general. This movie stars Gerard Butler and Gary Oldman. Gary Oldman being a great actor, Gerard Butler being sometimes great. Gerard Butler is still getting lead roles, which I guess is good for him making a living, but basically any film he's done over the last 10 years that hasn't been called 300 has been mediocre to just plain terrible. Will Hunted Killer change that? Will Gary Oldman build Gerard Butler up, or will he be dragged down with Gerard Butler? I don't know, but this is a movie I probably will see, and I'll let you know what I think come next week's show. Another film that's coming out in theaters nationwide this coming weekend is one called Johnny English Strikes Again, which has Rowan Atkinson coming back as the titular character that he's played in 3 movies. This is his 3rd since 2003. And in this film, after a cyber attack reveals the identity of all the active undercover agents in Britain, Johnny English, Rowan Atkinson, is forced to come out of retirement to find the mastermind hacker. I'm very excited to see this one. I like the original Johnny English. I didn't see the second one, but the first Johnny English movie was really funny. And of course, I've been a fan of Mr. Bean for quite some time. And Rowan Atkinson is certainly a physical comedian who gets the credit that he deserves in his native Britain, but may not get the same kind of credit here in America. But either way, Johnny English Strikes Again is a film that I will see, and I'll review it for you come next week's show.